So the basic theme is about, we are all very, very worried about why the nation functions the way it does. And there are many reasons for, especially the last part of the title, which is corruption in India. There are many reasons for that. But one central reason, the thesis of this argument that I'm placing before you, is that the system that we have put in place, the legal framework that governs the electoral process, has resulted in counterproductive outcomes that have really messed things up. So what I'm going to do now is, in a hopefully accessible manner, take you through that little journey and try and convince you that I've got some story to tell. So if you were to do a little Google search on corruption in India, how do we work this out? These are all just pictures from the internet. Is there somebody here who can make this work as just where every page down works? One second, I'll ask. It's a PDF, not a PPT, that's the problem. So can you just work it? We'll just work it, yeah, okay. So it's just a PDF, so yeah, you'll have to keep doing a scroll down. Okay. So if you were to do a quick search for corruption in India and look for images on Google, so I claim no copyright on these pictures. I'm just sure. In fact, given the party I represent, I wouldn't even want to show you these particular pictures. But the point is that on the internet, if you were to search for these things, images, you'd see these sorts of pictures that show up, which say things like, things that I don't understand what that's about. But anyway, the basic point is, there's been a chronology of various scams over the years, and Bofors, Harshad Mehta. See, some of these are, of course, alleged scams, so let's be clear on that. Anyway, continue, let's go. And after 2014, please. Yeah. We have my former colleague in the middle, Mr. Malia, and we have Chota Modi on the left side, Chota Modi or Bada Chota Modi on the other side. So basically, there have been no shortage of scams in the larger Indian landscape. The basic, and of course, we keep raising questions constantly about, go ahead, the next slide. Yeah. So, for example, in the renegotiated Rafale deal, right? This is not a political talk. I'm just raising these as issues that are out there, some which gain traction, some which don't. But basically, our government had been negotiating a 136 plane deal, and then suddenly that was scrapped. Something else was negotiated off the shelf, and the offset, the Indian production contract went to an industrialist very close to the current regime. And as a matter of fact, someone who was my senior from graduate school. So it's the same person. But anyway, and then of course, if you start looking at scams everywhere else, Vyapam, you have a whole bunch of scams in, peanut chicky scam in Maharashtra, all kinds of innovative scams, right? Fodder scam, which has sent former chief ministers of Bihar to jail, right? So is there something particularly wrong with us as a nation, as people, that we want to be scamsters? Or is there some other larger challenge that we're facing, right? So it's a real rotten state of affairs. When you think about where we rank, when we think about levels of corruption that Transparency International or someone else has gone out there and ranked, we find that we rank, pretty bad amongst somewhere halfway between countries that have been, either Denmark or some Scandinavian country is regarded as amongst the cleanest, while we are somewhere halfway between, on the scale of corrupt to non-corrupt. Continue, please. Yeah. So, what's the impact of all this? One of the things, different scholars, different practitioners have come up with analyses which say, what goes wrong with India? And one of the things that, say, Harvard professor Lant Pritchett argues is that India is a flailing state. What he means by this is that it's not a failing state. It hasn't collapsed or anything like that. But flailing is a particular kind of, oops, hold on. Yeah, sorry. Flailing is a particular kind of physical affliction where you don't have much control over your limbs and your movements, right? So the basic argument he's making here is that the brain, the central government maybe, sends an order down the system, says do this, but something else happens, right? So if you say we want to provide universal education to our children, but if a lot of teachers don't show up, then there's a problem with the state and its ability to deliver services. How does that happen and why? And is there some larger reason behind all these things for the collapse of the system in some ways? That's really the question. Another of our leading intellectuals, Pratap Bhanu-Mehta, argues that the government of India is a government by contractors, of contractors, for contractors. Now, I mean, being a contractor is a perfectly legitimate profession, but there's an implication here that it's a government that is not existing to serve, is not of the people, by the people, for the people, but for a particular class of business people who are possibly ripping off the country. That's the implication here. And Raghuram Rajan basically argues that there is a nexus between the politician, the businessman, and the people themselves. So what does he say? The crooked politician needs the businessman to provide the funds that allow him to supply patronage to the poor and fight elections, right? It's not just to fight elections, but also to keep the people happy with various kinds of sops, you might say. And the corrupt businessman needs the crooked politician to get public resources and contracts cheaply. So someone is going to rip off the government, and the politician needs the votes of the poor and underprivileged. So everyone is sort of tied to one another in this somewhat negative iron triangle. So nobody breaks this system which has evolved over the years. And if you were to look at the changing composition of Parliament, before, in the early years, we used to have a lot of we used to have a lot of lawyers. We still have. And some Supreme Court lawyers tend to juggle, spend some of the day in the Supreme Court and some of the afternoon in Parliament as well, some of the top leading lights. But in any case, today, you have, maybe 120 out of 788 members who are primarily businessmen. Okay? Now, again, as I say, look, I used to teach in a business school. I have a PhD from a business school. I have nothing against business people. It's just that the overall attitude is sometimes, let's work out a deal for ourselves rather than think about what's best for the country. Okay. And why are they there? Why are they there? Because basically the amount that they may have to invest in being in politics may be a fraction of what they stand to gain from the connections and the influence that they obtain from being in the parliamentary system. Okay, go ahead. So this is just, again, another picture that's off the internet. So any idea who the lady in the center is, if you can see from there? Okay, the name spells Neera Radia. That's the name, right? Okay. Neera Radia was, again, a very, very successful lobbyist. And one of the things that the government suspected was that she was evading taxes. So in order to check whether she was evading taxes, they went ahead and tapped her phone. And then when they started listening to her conversations, it turned out that she was actually running a parallel government. Okay, so these are all the people who she was having conversations with, working out deals with, etc. And you have leading politicians all across. You have a couple of people from the DMK, you have somebody from the Congress on top, somebody from the NCP. You also have a whole bunch of industrialists, including people like Ratan Tata, who has an image of not being associated with these sorts of things. You have a couple of the Ambanis. You have a whole bunch of, you even have Arun Shourie down at the bottom. right? And basically what was going on there was people were asking her, look, we want to get the telecom portfolio. Can you help us get it? And we help our party get it. And when the party gets it, give it to, Raja rather than Maran, or whatever the case may be. So a lot of influence peddling in some ways was also there. And there's some journalists who are also involved, right? And over the years, if you listen to political circles, you'll hear mention of different lobbies that have a very significant influence in the political system. The next one is the liquor lobby, right? And for example, there used to be a gentleman called Ponti Chadha, okay, in Uttar Pradesh, who was a very, very wealthy and influential liquor lobbyist or whatever, a liquor contractor, really, who died. Anyone heard of him? Yeah, he died in a major shootout with his brother, okay? But basically, how does the liquor lobby operate? Just to give you one example, typically any liquor that has to leave the factory has to go out with an excise stamp on it, saying we paid excise duty to the state government. Now, so a lot of people will send out bottles from the factory without actually paying excise duty, but possibly with a stamp on it, which makes it difficult to track who's paid excise duty or not. All those bottles that are sold for which excise duty was not paid are also sold at the same market price, right? So some of you may be saying, oh, where can I get that cheaper liquor? No. You'll get it only at the same price. Okay, the basic point is, then once so there's some extra money that's now in the hands of the liquor sellers, which they don't owe anybody. They don't owe the government. It's just extra cash in their pocket, right? So this is the sort of money that they use to fund politicians, fund elections, and maintain the situation where nobody cracks down on them, right? So this is one way in which, and whose money was that? If it was supposed to come to the state, it's your and my money, right? Should have been used for some other development activity. Instead, it's going to perpetuate one kind of political business nexus. Okay, so that's one way it goes. Lots of infrastructure projects, supposedly, you have big players from this region who possibly got bigger deals at favorable rates and then reneged on them and all sorts of stories. And that could be one of the reasons for non-performing assets. So that's also part of this whole story. Next, yeah. You have rackets related to tankers. And that's another problem in many parts, where if there's drought relief and that is coming to, it's captured by certain political classes, and then you have this tanker economy that makes a lot of money, again generating resources. A good book to read on that broader topic is by Sainath, Everybody Loves a Good Drought. Okay? Anyway, continue please. Okay, so everywhere, there are lots and lots of rackets. Mining, of course, was the main scam in Karnataka, my state, where, our famous Reddy brothers, for example, were accused of even changing the boundary between Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh because they had contracts in Andhra Pradesh, but were illegally mining on the other side of the border. Okay? So that sort of a situation was going on. Anyway, so where is the problem? So is the problem with us, the political class? Is it with India, that as a nation we are a bunch of corrupt people and given an opportunity we'll rip off the system? I don't think so. I basically argue that it's really the system that we've created, which engenders this kind of behavior. Please continue. So first, actually, just think about who comes into politics in the first place. How many of you have aspirations of a political career? Very good. This is way more. This is way more than you normally see elsewhere. Stay in touch after the class. Anyway, the basic point is, what motivates you, right? I'm not asking you, but I'm just saying. I'm sure one of these answers is there. If not, you can raise your hand and tell me what's your motivation. But basically, I'm motivated by public service and wanting to transform public policy for the better. Many others are motivated by private ambition. It's a pathway to wealth, to glory, to fame and fortune and things like that. But also, many are people who, especially in rural areas, a lot of people get into politics because they have a lot of free time and they want to spend it in influential, active circles. And of course, I just already mentioned, many people see politics as a way to enrich themselves. And in general, as a result of this sort of a framework, you end up with a lot of people who hang around politicians who have an expectation that the politician will take care of them through contracts and some, helping them become influential themselves. You know, somebody wants a seat, somebody wants a transfer, and if they're able to show that they can deliver on that, then their own status in their circles will go up. And a lot of this is, actually, it's a very status conscious, a lot of people will get in. People will pay, crores and crores to get into the Rajya Sabha, not because they want to get anything necessarily out of it, but that status, I'm also an MP, something like that also exists. Okay? Many others, of course, want to be in proximity to the powers that be. Continue, please. So, my basic argument is, everyone says we're the world's largest democracy. I argue that we are the world's largest hypocrisy. Okay? Why? Because we ignore the costs of democracy. We just assume that politicians will come about, elections will happen, democracy will continue to flourish, but we ignore the fact that every one of these things has an economic aspect, and that is actually a harsh reality. Okay? So when I say politicians to live on love of fresh air, right? So if you want a healthy democracy, you need elections. For elections to be competitive, you need good political parties that are healthy and are able to mobilize. If you look at your neighboring state, Andhra, what is Jagan Mohan Reddy doing right now? He's on a Padayatra around the state, right? So he is spending all his time in the opposition trying to mobilize, and for that Padayatra, again, he's just taking a walk, right? So it should be free. No. It costs a lot of money to organize the whole thing and to keep the crowd showing up and everything else. So that's the basic challenge, that these are all highly resource intensive. Elections, parties, everything else that goes along with it. But more than anything else, also just being a politician. The reason why historically a lot of lawyers were politicians is because they, after the court, they had free time on their hands. It suited their career also to be public figures, to be involved in larger causes that could lead to more, cases coming, more briefs coming to them, etc. So that's one of the professions that could benefit from, economically also, it was sustainable. Okay, so a doctor who works, 16 hours a day has no time to be a politician. Someone who's clocking in a government office doesn't have time to be a politician, right? So there are all those other realities. But to be a full-time politician means that you actually need to have resources to survive, right? And that we tend not to recognize at all. I mean, if I can take a small side note here, during the UPA years, we had members of parliament salary was 16,000 rupees. Okay, then the UPA raised it to 50,000 rupees, and actually most recently Mr. Jaitley has been kind enough to double that. Okay, but basically when 16,000 was raised to 50,000, there was a furor in the media. People, Arnab Goswami is shouting about 300% increase in salaries when the economy has not grown by 8% or something like that, right? Okay. And I wrote an article in Outlook called exactly that, The Wages of Democracy. And I said, look, you can't survive if you don't earn enough, right? And don't give me this nonsense that everyone is corrupt and therefore they don't need money. Right? There are enough people. If you come to Parliament House when the Parliament adjourns for the day, then you will see one set of MPs will come out and get into the fanciest cars in the country. The rest of us will go and take the Parliament shuttle for 10 rupees to get a ride home. Okay? Basically, that's the big difference between the range of people who inhabit that same august house. But the point is, you don't want to create a situation where people are forced to, get into corrupt practices. The kind of expectations that people have when you visit a politician's house, right? They want, people will come to you. They will want to at least have a cup of coffee. Others will come with actually tangible problems. They'll say, I have this child's wedding. I have this medical bill I cannot pay. Please help me out. What are you going to do? Okay. So these are all, challenges that are out there and people face. But basically, we assume that and the MPs getting this salary are the lucky ones. They're at least getting a salary. What about their competitors? People who have to work full time. Where's their resource going to come from? Right? So one of the challenges we have is that we are in denial about the essence of democracy, that we need political players, political parties, and vibrant competitive elections. So that's one of the challenges that we have to get over. And if you look at the legal system that we have developed in this context, the same sense of denial permeates the legal system, legal framework that governs parties and elections. Please continue. Okay. So, right. So look at the third paragraph there. Resources ideally should be raised and spent transparently between and during elections. We want, let's recognize the fact that parties and elections cost money, running parties and fighting elections. And as a nation, what should be our policy goal? That we should know, where is this money coming from? How is it being raised? Who is paying whom? What are they getting for that? Right? All that these are the sort of reasonable questions that we might want to expect. And we don't want our politicians to be in the thrall of any one interest group in the country. Right? Do you agree with me? Broadly? Okay, continue. All right. So, and we should have a level playing field across parties and candidates. It should not be just one person and, what should we say? One sec, Malavika, if you actually had downloaded this and put it into page up, page down, instead of scrolling, it may be easier. Can you think? Too late? Okay, it didn't work. All right. We're not capturing everything, every line on the screen. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Continue, please. Okay. So what has happened is that we've evolved very complex election expenditure, party funding, and reporting and disclosure laws. And basically, these are the central conclusion that we can draw is that these laws are in denial. All right? And not just are they in denial, they've had perverse impacts on the larger political economy. Continue, please. They create a dependence on black money and trigger extensive corruption in the system. Okay, please continue. Okay, so before I go into this, I'll just tell you what I mean by this, right? So just after the Karnataka election that took place a few weeks ago, I spent some time with my newly elected MLA colleagues in a resort. This is all part of the effort to keep them from the other side. And I spent a lot of time discussing how much they spend, what life's like, etc. Because this is, I'm still an academic at heart, and this is all part of my field research. So fundamentally, people are talking of spending 15-20 crores for an assembly election. Winners and one or two losers also would have spent similar amounts, right? I know all of you are going to get mega salaries when you graduate from here, but even then, this is a serious amount, okay? And then, so I asked them, so what happens as a result? How do you raise this? How do you sustain this kind of expenditure? And basically the answer is, what to do, sir? We all came in with some ideals, but the only way we can play the game and stay in the game is by spending these vast amounts, and we have to collect those amounts from various kickbacks and contracts. And so we've essentially created a system where every player is out there saying, okay, the only way I can be competitive is by milking the system, right? So that's really the root of the problem. I'm just summarizing that to some extent. Yeah. Now, one second. So way back, 1951, Representational People's Act, right? So what did this idealistic group of parliamentarians come up with? Basically, they said, look, we should have, elections should be accessible to the common man. Therefore, let us put a cap, spending cap on how much can be spent on elections. Sounds good. Okay. Well, if anyone exceeds that cap, they will be disqualified. Okay. Wow, good. That's a law with a penalty thrown in, right? Excellent. Then, go ahead. Okay. By the 1960s, we had evolved what was derisively termed by Rajaji as the license permit Raj. And during this time, while the logic of this policy was that we had a shortage of resources and they had to be allocated across priority domains rather than all going to some sectors. It resulted in a situation where getting hold of a license or a permit was the most crucial ingredient to business success. So where would you, so you wouldn't necessarily compete in the market, you would compete in the corridors of power, right? And so if you visited some high-level political functionary or bureaucrat and forgot to take back your suitcase with you, they may be, they may look at you very kindly after that, right? So basically, we ended up seeing corruption emerge from those days when it turned out that you could get your permit or license by working out a deal with whoever was issuing that to you. And in the late 60s, after the Congress party split and the establishment, the Congress organization, was seen as much closer to the industrialists of Bombay, Morarji Desai and others were some of the leading lights, until then corporate donations were actually legal, and Mrs. Gandhi went ahead and banned them. This is sort of a way of curbing the other side's ability to raise resources. But without an alternative, legitimate source of funding, the only money that started coming into the political landscape was actually, black money from somewhere or the other. At that time, expenses were still relatively low. Typically, you would have sort of wealthy local notables contesting elections. It was mostly a rural country, and so in every taluka, in every rural area, until the 60s or so, mostly you had people from the freedom movement, people from various other movements and socialist movements and things like that who emerged and contested, and the expenses were not particularly large. Actually, today, the reason for runaway expenses is because you've ended up having too many business guys coming into the system with wealth as candidates, and they have nothing to report other than the fact that they have a lot of wealth. And so now they started getting into this business of buying votes, right? And where they would buy votes for 100 rupees, it may now be 2,000 rupees. Next election, 4,000 rupees. And while in 2004, I would run into voters who would say, what to do, sir? I've taken from this side, my wife has taken from that side, so I'm going to vote for him, she's going to vote there. There was a certain naive honesty about how people would deal with this money. Today, they will demand money from every party contesting and then do whatever they want. So what has happened, in research, there's a famous phrase called necessary but not sufficient, right? You would have heard that. So basically, spending money by giving money to voters has become a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient at all to win because voters do whatever they want after that. It's like a price you pay to be in the game, and it's become, it's really, really terrible. Okay, so basically there were a whole bunch of legal developments. In 1974, the Supreme Court said that any money spent on behalf of a candidate needs to be included under the candidate's spending limit, right? And immediately across party lines, people come together and say, this is the most crazy law, nobody can spend anything. And of course, we passed amendments that overruled this particular law. So one major loophole in the larger electoral process, thank you, is that there is no cap on political party spending. There continues to be a cap on candidate spending, all right? So, and of course, the other good things we've done is we've exempted political parties from income taxes, etc., and reopened this corporate donations possibility by allowing companies to give 5% of their net profit over the last 3 years officially through checks. And for that matter, every one of you can contribute through checks and get it deducted from your taxable income. Okay, so we've put together a reasonably nice system to incentivize people to contribute. However, people haven't bought the idea very much. Go ahead. Okay. Some years ago, one of the leading NGOs that focus on reforms, broadly speaking, the Association for Democratic Reforms, they went to the Delhi High Court. There's an interesting story about this, about legal strategy, right? These were people who were very upset that too many criminals were occupying important positions, getting into politics, winning elections, etc. And so they were trying to figure out, how do we tackle this system, right? And they figured ultimately that the only way they could make any headway was just by asking for information. That was it. Right? So they went to the Delhi High Court, they looked for a potentially favorable judge, and once they got that, they got a judgment where the judge said, okay, what are you asking for? You want to know, as a voter, what are the educational qualifications of your candidate, what are the criminal record of the candidate, if any, and of course, what are the assets and liabilities of that candidate, right? So this itself was opposed by members of parliament across party lines. Anyway, there was a lot of drama that went on between parliament and President, I think, Abdul Kalam at that time. And ultimately, the law did get passed, which said, okay, when you file an affidavit, you have to provide all this information. And so the logic behind this move of ADR was that, one, you'll know who the guys are with criminal charges against them, right? So that at least that amount of transparency is possibly out there for voters. The second part is that if in one election a person has so many assets, and in the next election he has 10 times or 100 times the assets, you might want to raise the question, how did you do this? We keep raising this question about, for example, the national president of one of our leading parties, his son, who suddenly saw wealth increase dramatically, right? We want to know these techniques and teach them to all of you, but it's not available, the inside information. So basically, this law came in and that information is out there, all right? And by the way, this business about criminals, you have to look deeper. Sometimes when you violate some prohibitory order, you may face a criminal charge. Sometimes the real criminals are the ones who have charges like rape and murder and attempt to murder and things like that. We have quite a few of them in our illustrious house. Anyway, we've also increased the campaign limits. But even the UPA, when they raised the Lok Sabha spending limit, they raised it to 70 lakhs per Lok Sabha seat, right? So if you have 21 lakh voters, okay, and you have 70 lakhs that you can spend, right? Can you really campaign in any manner that communicates to the voters what you would want to communicate to them? Can you send them a postcard? Can you send them, can you print pamphlets and deliver it to each of them, given everything else that goes along with that? So basically, you can see right away that the costs of elections and the cap on how much you can spend have no relation to one another. So this creates a problem for anyone who wants to be an honest politician, who wants to raise the money and adhere to this particular rule. Because if you want to raise money, you can't raise more than how much you can actually spend. And if you only spend this much when everyone else is spending much more, right, you are essentially non-competitive. How is everyone else spending much more? They're not spending openly, they're spending underground. So this is what I mean when you have perverse outcomes from a law like this. Well-intentioned, we want to create a level playing field, low expenses. Well, what happens is, it is a competitive game. People will do whatever it takes within reason to win an election. So if it means having to distribute a lot of cash surreptitiously, then that's exactly what will happen. Okay, and that's what has happened, right? So this is not, former Prime Minister Vajpayee once said, every MP begins his career with a lie. Okay? Why? Because the first thing you have to do within 1 month of winning an election, you have to file what's called an account statement. How much did you spend on that election? And everyone, Sharad Pawar is on record of saying, 70 lakhs is the limit. He spent only 5 or something like that. You should look at that. I mean, of course, he's a very famous man. He's done amazing work. So maybe that's true. But the basic point is, it's very hard to believe that anyone reporting expenditures is reporting the truth, right? Now, as students of law, do you want a law which forces every elected representatives to lie on their first day of office? How many say yes? Raise your hand. Okay, good. The basic point is, any law that forces people to do illegal stuff is not a good law, right? Well, such a law exists. And the late Mr. Gopinath Munde, in a public meeting, actually he said this, he said, When I first contested the Maharashtra Assembly election in 1980, my expense was 9,000 rupees, of which 7,000 was borne by the party. But my expenditure in the 2009 Lok Sabha poll was 8 crores. You can see this clipping online. He actually says, I don't care if there's somebody from the election commission here, this is the reality that we have to live with, right? So you can obviously see that when he started, he was a very simple man of modest means. If he spent 8 crores in 2009, maybe he had developed a lot of influential friends who helped him out, whatever the case may be, right? But that's the thing. There is a huge gap between what the law says and what the reality is. Please continue. And ultimately, if the only guys who have access to black money and the networks to distribute that are people who are, on the other side of the law, then there's no surprise that we have a whole bunch of criminals entering the political system. Okay, 1/5 of MPs are named in a serious criminal case, the kind that I mentioned to you. Go ahead. Next. The crazy part is, those who spend more money are much more likely to win elections, right? The richest candidates are 20 times more likely to win elections than the poorest candidates. Poorest, of course, will be too poor to. But basically, what I'm trying to argue is that there is a threshold of expenditure that you have to be able to spend. Without that, you're not competitive. All right? You don't have to match the richest guys, but you need some amount of a campaign to be viable. All right, please. Yeah. And there's a recent book called When Crime Pays by Milan Vaishnav, who actually looks at this whole issue. And he says, look, what's happened today is political parties also they prefer candidates who are very wealthy by themselves, who have their own networks and teams, right? And why? Because that way the party doesn't need to actually give them a lot of resources. And so you see across the board a lot of criminal candidates who are wealthy coming in and dominating the political process. In this region, historically we've had extraordinarily wealthy candidates. In the undivided Andhra Pradesh, when I look at the members of parliament, each one was a mega player. It was not, it was a state of oligarchs in some ways. Yeah, continue. And if you ask people, why do you vote for criminals, right? And the first 68% say the candidate does good work, he's a powerful candidate, he spends a lot. The cases are not serious. They're justifying that he's not really a criminal, or the voters don't know the details. Oh, really? Is he a criminal? We didn't know. Or he's from our caste or religion, Hamara Aadmi hai, right? Okay, next. So, basically, all I'm pointing out is the same story that my MLA friends told me in the resort. If the whole system is geared towards, we're all out there trying to figure out how to make as much money to become more powerful politicians, to sustain our livelihood in this particular domain, then we have no alternative but to play that particular game, right? Those who don't play that game, send them to the Rajya Sabha. Okay, or some of us. No, I got a free merit seat, So basically, I can actually make that statement compared to the captation seats that some of my colleagues come through. Anyway, now there's this whole story about vote buying, right? And in Mr. Qureshi's book about the Election Commission, he actually has some 40 ways that people break the rules and give money to voters. In the morning newspaper with the morning milk, there will be an envelope with some cash plus the party's candidate's voting slip, right? And the kind of creativity that politicians show is just amazing. Professor Tyagi here teaches economics, and one of the things about economics is there's a phrase called incentive compatibility. When you want to get someone you have a contract with someone, you want to arrange it in such a way that they do what you want them to do, right? So one candidate that I've come across would give out one earring to women voters, okay? And he'd say, I'll give you the matching earring after I win, okay? So that's actually something that's incentive compatible. Now that person will vote for you, because if you win, the matching earring will come, will even campaign for you. Right? So that's the kind of, because only if you win will you get that earring, right? So those sorts of creative developments also take place in the vote buying arena. Please continue. Other problems on the side, right? So if you want to essentially create a momentum for yourself, well, one other way is to use the media, right? And it turns out that our great free press, neutral press, etc., watchdog of the nation, that's all in theory. In reality, recently there was even a sting operation, if you remember. There was not that much coverage of that particular story. But people went around to leading media houses and said, will you run these stories which will cause communal violence in the country for so much money? And some of the topmost newspapers and television channels said, sure, give me that money. I don't care if the country goes up in flames, I want that money, right? That's the kind of media that we live with, all right? And this is again a little cartoon. I mean, the presentation's here if anyone wants it, where it says, Netaji, I'm from the paid news of India. My marketing team wants to meet you. And I've also experienced this. The moment, say, one of my friends is a candidate, I'll get a call saying, sir, please take me to this candidate. We have a package of coverage and things like that. And then keep going, keep going. Look at the last, okay. No, the last thing out there. Yeah, the second last slide on the bottom, second last frame, says, hope you're not going to give positive coverage to my rivals. So then the guy responds from the newspaper marketing team. He says, for negative news, we have another package. So basically, the whole this thing. Go on, next slide. So this is a rate card for paid news in a small town, right? If you want this, this is how much you have to pay, etc. I mean, as I said, these are all taken from the internet. I haven't created them, but they are illustrating the point I'm trying to make here, which is that what you see and the stories that are run, especially at election time, you can't really believe that anymore, that they are neutral, factually right, accurate, or anything like that. So this is not the kind of environment that you want to create in India. Well, that's what you ended up with, because we've got a whole bunch of people playing with black money in the system, right? What does it take to win an election, by the way? I mean, we talked about love and fresh air. Yeah, just let's do one case study. Go on. We had star campaigner Mr. Modi. How much did it take? You remember, I mean, he's an amazing campaigner, obviously, and he's spends half his term doing nothing but, okay? But the basic point is, you just got out, right? In the 2014 election, 150 rallies, he would, basically people would talk admiringly about the fact that wherever he is, he still goes back home to Ahmedabad to sleep at night or something like that, right? Okay, every one of these things costs money. And where was that coming from? How much was it costing? What does it cost to run a rally? Go ahead. Yeah. So if you had a Hunkar rally in, I think it was in Bihar, right? Okay, how much did it cost you? It cost approximately 10 crores. 100 million is how much? 10 crores? Right. So that's no joke. For one event, it costs so much more. Okay. And, Bangalore cost of a rally that took place in Bangalore was 20 crores. Right. Somebody's got to, pay for this. Right. And why are they so expensive? Partly because there's a lot of arrangements that are involved. People are bussed in and, whatever. There are posters everywhere. And when people are bussed in, they're also paid to come in and attend the rally, and they're given food and things of that sort. So there's a lot of this that, so it's not easy, it's very, very costly, and this is not included in the candidate spending, by the way. This is party expenditure, okay? So this is what I mean when I say there's a lot of money involved in elections. Continue. People spent a lot of money. In the Karnataka election, one of the arguments that I make is that the Congress was outspent by the BJP when it comes to advertising, okay? And even if that made a 1% difference in the vote share, that was enough. 1% more for us, 1% less for them would have switched the seat numbers, in the opposite direction. All right? But Mr. Dilip Cherian puts the blame on you guys, right? We're dealing with a new generation of youthful voters who like to see a sense of scale, he says. You want to see big-size rallies and drama. So just for you, we're doing all this, boss. Continue. Next. Okay. And then, of course, he had his holograms. These are the front page jackets of newspapers on the day of the elections. Lots of expenditure. Continue. So basically, what is reported to the Election Commission and what is actually spent, there's a huge gap between the two, right? Okay, and we spend as much as the US election. Across parties, we spend about $7 billion on an election. Someone referred to this as a Keynesian boost to the economy. right? That's the kind of boost that comes in due to an election. Continue. This is just a picture, again from that same Outlook story, on what all people spend money, including donating cows, by the way, if you're wondering what a cow's doing in that bottom corner. Okay, continue, please. Okay. So, do parties report this? So, if you estimate that the BJP spent about 780 million, when they actually filed their expenditure statement, it was 110 million. Congress filed expenditure of 80 million. So these are even these reports, it's very hard to believe that they are actually accurate. Please continue. Now, where do we spoke for some time about expenditure. What about funding? Where does that come from, right? Well, if you look at where do parties get their money from, it basically about 80% plus comes from what are called unknown sources, right? So what does this mean? This basically doesn't mean that some random people came and dropped something off. It is you don't have to report. Historically, you didn't have to report any donation below 20,000 rupees. So if I wanted to give 1 lakh to a party, I would give 5 tranches of 19,000 and 1 tranche of 5 more thousand, right? So that way the reporting never happens. That's the sort of loophole that used to exist. Continue. And if you see, one of the other fascinating things about India is that we have something called dynastic politics, right? Political movements such as the Akali Dal, such as the Dravida movement have become essentially family parties, right? So, can you find a link between this outcome? Is it only because we're all a bunch of feudals and we want kings to rule us? No. There are, again, economic and legal reasons why this arises. Because typically what happens is, one person is leading a party, the resources all flow towards him or her, and that person will then marginalize all his or her rivals. The resources are then, to manage this carefully, you trust only people very close to you, often your own family, right? And then you basically take over a party or a movement. All right? That's typically what ends up happening. So, that's, of course, voters can reject and all that sort of thing. But, in many particular domains, this is at the party level. But even at the very assembly or Lok Sabha constituency level, typically you have dynasties which perpetuate their control over constituencies over time. Continue, please. So what are we doing about it? That's the question. Now go ahead. In the last finance bill, for the first time, not for the first time, but first time in recent memory, or in my parliamentary career, we had the finance minister standing up and saying things like, political parties are an essential ingredient. Even 70 years after independence, the country has not been able to evolve a transparent method of political funding, which is vital to the system of free and fair elections. So we're like sitting there and listening to him. Oh, what's he going to come up with, right? And he comes up with some proposals. Go ahead. So what does he do in that finance bill? One, he says, we used to have this 20,000 rupee loophole. I'm bringing it down to 2,000, right? Big deal. More paperwork for me. If I have to give 1 lakh, now I have to give, 50 tranches of, 1999, and then 1 tranche of whatever's remaining, right? Okay. So it's just extra paperwork. It doesn't solve that problem. Then he comes up with something called electoral bonds. So he says, look, we need to make sure that white money comes into the system. So these bonds can be bought only in banks, right? Okay. Then he says, and in banks, you have to transact with essentially white money, right? That's the assumption. Some of you lived through demonetization, right? How much black money was converted to white money? How many of our leading lights of the banking system are clean, right? So basically, I don't believe for a second that, cash cannot be converted into white money to buy electoral bonds. So that clean money test is gone. The other reason why the other thing they've done is they've made these bonds anonymous. So once it's given to a political party, the party doesn't know who it came from. Of course, the party will know, but the public will not know. So the BJP can take as much as it wants from all its crony friends, but none of us can ever accuse them of having taken money from these guys or delivered a policy outcome as a consequence of that, right? So that's one of the central issues in analyzing politics is the phrase, follow the money. Why did this policy come about in this way? Well, who was lobbying for it? What were the pressure groups that wanted it, etc.? Well, you can't follow the money anymore with electoral bonds. And of course, so what else? Yeah, And then, does anyone pay enough attention to this budget and things like that? What else was passed during that finance bill on electoral funding? Go ahead. Contributions Regulation Act. Yeah. So we had this fascinating situation where two of the leading political parties of the country, that shall remain unnamed, basically had received contributions from, I think, Vedanta, which was actually headquartered in London. Okay, and operates in India. So obviously the Indian branch has given that money, but I know this is an open legal contribution. But technically it violated the FCRA, the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act. So one of the things that was added, one of the amendments to this particular law was just one line which said, and by the way, any donation received after 1970 under this particular law is perfectly legal, or something like that. It was retrospectively made legal. All right, and since the two major political parties were the ones involved, nobody has made a noise about it. Just some random activists have even filed a PIL on the particular subject. Anyway, continue. So the question is, as I said, electoral bonds. My other problem with it is, while you say that it's going to be this anonymous process, a lot of these all have to be done through State Bank of India. State Bank of India is a public sector bank. Public sector banks, there is some amount of control that can be exercised by the finance ministry. So this notion that we won't know who's giving to whom, I may not know, you may not know, but certainly the government can figure out from the bank who contributed to whom. And once you know who's contributing to the other side, you can call them up, and this government seems to do that. Because the Aam Aadmi Party, which I'll come to very shortly, has complained that anyone who gave them significant chunks of money has faced an IT notice or a raid afterwards. Okay, so so basically, that's when they were declaring names on their website, but. Basically, if only the government in charge knows who's giving this money, then, and then they can threaten them, etc. That's not a very good outcome to have. So the electoral bonds, while argued as a very major positive step, is hardly such a step. Continue, please. Okay. So, yeah, I've already explained this. Next. Yeah. And if you look at where the money is going, it's going from electoral bonds, electoral trusts, etc., from various corporates. But even though it's supposed to be white money, I don't particularly believe there's too much of that. Okay? So what are the barriers to improving the system? Criminal politicians, money power, these sort of paid media, lack of inner-party democracy, things like that. Continue. So how to break these barriers? Okay? First one is, of course, look for loopholes that you can close. Okay, do you remember what that picture on the right is all about? Anyone? Yeah.
Who had criminal cases against him from the SP, Samajwadi Party.
Okay, now some of the details are not quite there, but see, basically, even if you're convicted of a crime, you don't lose your seat because you can appeal and go on and delay the whole process, right? So, I mean, it's not like the system doesn't work. The former Chief Minister of Haryana is in jail. The former Chief Minister of Bihar is in jail, right? I mean, so it's not, of Jharkhand is in jail. So it's not like it's not something that doesn't work, but doesn't usually work. And there was a court ruling which said, if you're convicted and sentenced to jail for more than 2 years, you automatically lose your seat and your right to contest for a few years, right? So at that point, once again, the entire political class across party lines came together and said, let's support an ordinance which will annul this particular court judgment. And suddenly, out of the blue, this is a remarkable scene actually, the Congress former minister Ajay Maken, who was our communications chief, he was holding a press conference where he was supporting this argument of why this ordinance was necessary. And suddenly, if you see this on video, because I wasn't there, I only saw it on TV, someone taps his shoulder and says, someone's coming there. And so he says, okay, 1 second, I'll be back. And he goes out and comes back in with Rahul Gandhi. And Rahul Gandhi speaks to the audience and says, this ordinance is nonsense, and he tears it up, and he walks away. And then poor Mr. Makan says, as I was saying, this ordinance is nonsense, and we need to oppose it with all our might. Okay? So, poor chap had to switch his position very, very quickly. And, I'm also a party spokesperson, and he used to be my boss at that time, and we all felt terrible. But he certainly handled it with tremendous presence of mind. Anyway, so that's the sort of thing. So now, under this, Lalu Prasad, for example, has gone to jail. Right? And got disqualified and things of that sort. And so this is one way that you're fixing the system to some extent. The other way is to have more open contributions, right? So one of the sad things about modern India, unlike in the US, where people say, you know what, I like this party, I like this policy, I'm going to contribute. Here, everyone will sit and say, Sangharsh karo, hum tumhare saath hai. Please go out there and fight. Yeah? We're with you, but nobody will campaign for you, no one will contribute. It's like that. Especially the educated, the well-off. Everyone are armchair supporters. And the Aam Aadmi Party, on the other hand, managed to raise funds openly, declared where they got this money from, and this is what I was talking about, actually put it up on their website. Now they've taken it off their website, and when you ask them, oh, okay, the experiment's over, they say, no, all our people got raided. All right? Even last evening, their New Delhi candidate Ashish Khaitan, we were together having a coffee for some other reason, and basically I was asking him this question. He said exactly that the guys raided were not necessarily big shots, but they were sort of second-tier businessmen who gave 5 lakhs, 10 lakhs, and things like that, and they don't want them to be raided anymore. So this whole idea of transparency is getting affected. Continue. And of course, they had tremendous media coverage, very creative ways of campaigning, etc., which lowered the costs of their elections. Continue. Okay. But, yeah, so they are not, this model doesn't seem to be sustainable right now because they don't want to reveal this information. It's not sustainable for another reason. And this is what I was telling Ashish last evening. I said, judging by the people you sent to the Rajya Sabha, out of the 3 people elected to the Rajya Sabha from the Aam Aadmi Party, one of them was a very wealthy businessman who was with the Congress and who supposedly has been given the AAP ticket because he said he would fund their Haryana election campaign, right? So then what's the big difference of this party that promised to be something different, right? So that's the sort of thing. Anyway, so my first argument is, smell the coffee, right? Basically, there are costs of elections. A lot of these costs are legitimate, right? You need to be able to provide food to volunteers, you need to be able to print handouts, you want to put up some posters. Elections should not be funerals. They've been reduced to that nowadays. Earlier, they used to be much more vibrant sort of festivals of democracy. And if you bring everything above ground, then people will also be able to judge who is a viable candidate, who is not, and things like that to some extent, rather than driving everything underground. And so basically get rid of election limits, expenditure limits, or make them much more realistic. Okay, that's the basic argument. Continue. Across the country, across the world, there's another phenomenon that has come in, which is something called public funding, right? So what's the logic of public funding of elections? Nobody wants corrupt politicians. If you actually look in every country, this problem of how to finance politics is there, right? So President Sarkozy of France was raided by income tax authorities who said, how much money did you take from Gaddafi, right? Okay, so I mean that sort of thing happens. In in other countries there are enough similar stories. There are Indian businessmen who were paying various political parties in Britain in exchange for a peerage to become Lord this or that. So everywhere fundraising is a problem. So my argument is, look, we all want a strong army, right? If we came and asked everyone for voluntary contributions, we may not. We may say, no, boss, it's too early in, I've spent all my money this month, come later, something like that. We want to find a way, let him pay for it, right? So what do we do as a nation? We use taxes, right? Because public goods can be provided only through compulsory taxation of those who can, whoever we choose to tax. Well, similarly, a clean polity is something, in my view, that is a really essential public good. And so if no one is willing to contribute, let me ask here, yeah, how many of you are willing to contribute 1,000 rupees for the next Lok Sabha campaign to the candidate or party of your choice? Yeah. Somebody sleeping, raise her hand. Yeah? So anyway, go ahead. Nobody? 1,000 rupees? No? See, sir? Better tax them. Okay. Okay. So this is the interesting part, right? So this is the real challenge that we face, right? We are not able to raise even small amounts because everyone says, I mean, by the way, the same people who didn't raise your hands, you want cleaner politics? A better system? Yeah? Hesitant nods? Okay. You want the state of Telangana to be sold to China? Whatever, I don't know. Whatever. The basic thing is if you don't fix the system, that's what's going to happen. Okay? Anyway, continue. So basically, I am arguing that a solution to this is public funding of elections, where we raise resources from the exchequer and provide that to candidates and parties. Why candidates? Because, go on, next. Okay, because if you just give it to parties, you're only concentrating the strength of the, concentrating resources again in the hands of the bosses, which worsens intra-party democracy. So let it get decentralized. Let it go to candidates everywhere. So who should it go to? What are we trying to create as a system? Let's create a system of incentives. The whole attitude in this legal framework has been, these are politicians, we need to, constrain them. We need to curb them. Come on, incentivize them to behave better instead, right? So that's the basic argument. So, and this should also be available to independent candidates. Continue. All right. So create a national election fund. Two kinds of grants from that. One to political parties based on their historic vote share, right? So if the Congress party got 19.3% of the vote, into whatever, 550 million who voted, then you give them 100 rupees per vote that they garnered, right? That solves some of their fundraising challenge. BJP got much more, don't worry, basically. And the point is, so it's a reflection of your capability on the ground, right? The other part, give it to parties and candidates as matching grants for the kinds of contributions you're able to raise, right? Small donations, 1,000 rupees from each of you. I mean, I'll keep repeating it. By the end of the class, you'll say, oh, give it to him and go. But basically, the point is, the issue is exactly that if people are able to raise small amounts, say even 2,000 rupees, 5,000 rupees, 10,000 rupees, we'll give a matching grant up to a particular level. So this is based as much on the number of people you raise funds from. Why? Because then this forces you not to be in the thrall of a particular corporate or something like that, but this way you are forced to build up a grassroots support base, right? Okay, so that's the argument. Continue. So again, you don't give it to everybody. Somebody who gets a minimum of 2% vote share, somebody who's able to raise, so many thousand, contributions from people, etc. Okay, those are details. That can be, as we say in Parliament, that will be sorted out in the rules. We don't worry about it in the text of the law. Go ahead. Okay? So these are matching grants and how much you will give. Now continue. The basic point is, please continue. This is all details on the conditions and all that. Yeah, so how much will this cost? Right? So I'm saying if you, whatever. So how much will this cost the nation? This will cost the nation 4 times what we allocate for MP-led funds. Right now, we give MPs 5 crores a year to spend on our constituencies, and this will cost 20,000 crores, right? Can a nation of our size afford 20,000 crores for a cleaner polity? As far as I'm concerned, absolutely yes. There's nothing, it's peanuts if it can change the larger outcome. Just remember that the corruption in the system is not just what happens with the politicians, right? So politician is raising it from, if there's a public work that's happening, then we will call the engineer says, okay, I've got this, so much I'm going to give you, and things like that. If you go to the municipal corporation, they'll say, this much I need to take because I need to send it up, things like that. But actually there's a tremendous amount of leakage along the way. everyone is corrupt. Not much of it actually reaches the top, right? So all that can go, the demand for that corruption can go down if we have alternative legal sources of fundraising. Yeah. And then, of course, there are other, get rid of election limits and expenditures, bring it above ground. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, we say, right? That sort of thing. Go on. Yeah. So basically, I argue that this will provide genuine people the threshold level of expenditure, that resources that they'll be able to compete, will be able to change the system from the corrupt equilibrium that we're currently in. Yeah. So also, whatever is spent in the media, we need better auditing so that we have a good sense of who earned how much for what kinds of rates. Yeah. So basically many other suggestions are there to improve democracy, but I'll skip over them for lack of time. That's it from my side. And so these are legal proposals. These are ways of changing the system, and I'm happy to entertain questions, comments, criticisms, any other kind of feedback. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, one second.
So, what suggestions do you suggest? I mean, in the past few months, we have seen that there's certain bias from media channels against a few parties or for a few parties. So, do you think that the election commission making more laws for it is necessary to have a clean elections?
No. The election commission doesn't regulate what comes in media houses, what slant they take. So, what's the question there?
No, my question. I mean, during election time, the content which the media houses display somehow indirectly affect the election, right? Oh. So, I mean, should there be something to regulate that content?
Yeah, that's a very tricky domain, because when it comes to freedom of the press, the political class is very, very hesitant to get mixed up with that. And so we'd rather leave it to self-regulation on the part of the Press Council of India, whatever, Editors Guild of India, and things like that. But there have been times, I have actually complained to the owner of one of the big national channels about a story that was run by one of his people, which could have resulted in communal riots across the west coast of Karnataka, right? I said the rumors that, see, there's a lot of false news, fake news that's out there. I mean, tomorrow, I think you have Pratik Sinha, who is coming here to speak, and he will tell you the kind of nonsense that's out there. But a lot of this nonsense is provocative stuff. It's aimed at, these lies are aimed at creating, tension and violence and division, right? And if that is aired on a national channel, and then, of course, that clip is sent everywhere, it's really, really dangerous, okay? But what can we do? Do you want to say every story has to be vetted with a censor? Or should they have party symbols on a particular TV channel? Not clear. Yeah, that's a domain that I'm hesitant to get into. Yeah, but certainly fake news needs to be spotted and outed. Yeah, go ahead.
You said the funds have to be allocated from the national election fund or to the parties based on their past vote percentage. But sir, it may be that a new party comes up with, like, for example, now a lot of farmers are coming with at the
yeah, no. This is a good legal mind speaking. Basically, yes, we have to figure out how to deal with this, because it shouldn't all be looking backwards. It should also be. So that party, if it has the ability to mobilize on a particular issue, then one way it can address this issue is by showing this is the kind of support we have, this is what people are contributing to us, and of course farmers in distress may be less able to contribute than now some students. But basically the point is, what shall we say, yes, there will be a little bit of imbalance, but we can tweak this. I mean, look, I've not worked out every detail, right? Yeah, no, we can think through this, and we can figure out a way to incentivize newer players to come in. Absolutely. I mean, farmers, recently there was a new Mahila Empowerment Party. Theoretically 50% of the country should be supporting it, or more, even those of us who are feminists from the other gender. But it's didn't have any traction, of course. But the point is, there could be all kinds of new movements that need to be encouraged, and we'll figure that out. Some amount of resources could be allocated to newer movements on some conditions. That's all. You can't just let it go, right? That's all. That's all.
One more question.
Go ahead. Yeah, just let him finish it off, sir, if you don't mind. Sorry. Finish it off.
Sir, now lots of political parties are showing that they have spent this much amount in the elections, but a lot of the amount is not shown. That is, they have spent it through other means, like you said, sir, through other means, like indirect means. So what is the guarantee that even after allocating funds from the National Election Fund, they will not spend money from, like, they will not accept donations from corporate cronies, or they will not spend from other sources?
Yeah. So this is, you can pass the mic. This is the basic challenge that everyone comes up with, who say, look, let the system get fixed. Let's get political parties to be allowed to be audited. A whole bunch of other changes before we give our public money. If we give our public money, all that you'll get is, those who already had money will have more money to spend, right? Now, I pointed out that you need a threshold level of expenditure to be competitive, right? The system that we're offering allows newer talent with some capability to get in and challenge the existing players, right? Now, that itself is an improvement on the system. It's not a perfection of the system. It doesn't make anything perfect, but it certainly gets us out of the equilibrium that we're in today. It will allow challengers. Aam Aadmi Party, where did they come from? How did they win 67 out of 70 seats in Delhi? Right? It's a combination of message, credibility of the leader at that time, historic networking, the cratering of our Congress Party support base, a whole bunch of factors. But it is possible for a new set of people without much resource to come in and challenge, right? So that's what we're trying to do, trying to shake the system up a bit. And if it shakes up enough, then maybe all the other changes will also kick in. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. Hello.
Hold it close, yeah.
Hello. Sir, my name is Harshvardhan Tripathi. The question I wish to ask is, if I understand you correctly, the agenda of this incentivizing politicians is to clean up the polity. But if I may point out, there are other players or stakeholders in the polity too, like bureaucrats. Would you be willing to extend the privilege of incentivizing even to the bureaucrats, or to the officials who are involved in the machinery? Because it's not only the politicians who are indulging in corrupt practices.
Yeah,
our experience says that, right?
So if you come across a bureaucrat who's indulging in corruption, nab them and put them in. I mean, that's... No. See, a bureaucrat has got into that particular job under a certain set of conditions, which is, and certainly people compete and spend a lot of time to get into those jobs. Of, vibrant elections, throwing incumbents out, things like that. I would say that we are a very healthy and mature democracy on those criteria. But basically, we've got to re-inculcate a culture of contributing and playing a more active role. We've improved. 10, 15 years ago, when I first came back from the US and was engaging in urban India, the people who most benefited from modern Indian democracy, the urban educated who were doing extremely well, they were the ones who would regard politicians as the new untouchables. They want nothing to do with you or politics or anything like that. It was, let's secede from the system and live in our own, gated communities or something like that. Okay, now at least people are engaging in political movements and parties and some amount of certainly WhatsApp forwards and things like that. But basically, that even participation was not there. There was the educated urban population had seceded from Indian democracy. Now they're somewhat hesitantly coming back, but their voting percentage itself is still low, right? And forget every other participation. So that's something that we all should introspect about.
Okay, just one last question
there.
That the entire country was very polarized, and to me it was very clear what the outcome would be. So how is it that the people who support the other party would like to make a contribution? because even if the thing is polarized and the people who support the winning party only they are paying, their funds are ultimately a part of it is going to the other party. How is that actually justified?
Yeah, so that puts a bigger challenge on the challenger, right? Put a bigger burden on the challenger. But typically those of us that are in the political fray are up for the challenge, right? It's okay. If we're the underdog, we'll fight. Okay, so we rarely, even though we also knew we were not winning that last election, did we not compete? We didn't say, okay, chalo, forget it, it's his turn this time, right? We all competed, we fought, and politicians actually, someone should do a psychological study, all believe that we're going to win that particular election. Nobody goes in there saying we're not going to win. It's a different story. But the basic point is, yes, you're right, there will be a certain amount of imbalance. There's also something called a bandwagon effect, where people would rather be with the winning party, and that worsens this imbalance.
Exactly.
Right?
Wouldn't this lead to a cyclical repetition of the same party being in power?
Yeah, so far we haven't seen that kind of outcome all the time. We have a fairly competitive democracy, but these are all certainly very, very good, hard questions that I have to ponder on a little more in detail. Scenarios that we need to think through and worry about whether this actually will reinforce the party and the people who are already in place and come in the way of newer competitive challengers. Yes, I think that's a very good point. Next presentation, we'll have an answer.
Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, Professor Gowda. We'd like to thank him especially because he came directly from the airport. I think he must be up since, very early in the morning. So thank you. I hope you took away something from the talk. I hope it will be helpful in some way, both in the course and outside. Siddharth, would you like to say something? Yeah, we can do that. Okay. Yeah, please get in touch. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Right? So, into the IAS or whatever the case may be, they have no business asking for any more resources than they signed up for, right? If they indulge in corrupt practices, then they should be, tried and convicted. Why do you want to incentivize them in any other way? It's not the kind of domain that requires incentives. Yeah. No, I'm trying to understand where you're coming from, and I'm not getting there.
Another problematic thing that I find is politicians really do not have any kind of qualification required to be in that place, other than to be popular enough to be chosen by the voters. Why do they have to be incentivized exactly if they do not?
Oh, yeah. Okay, you're missing out what I mean by incentivizing. What I mean by incentivizing is I'm trying to incentivize politicians to raise money from all of you, right? Okay, so that the country doesn't get into the hands of just one or two crony capitalists, right? We don't want politicians to be, I got my donation from Mr. A and Mr. A, and therefore whatever I do is for their benefit and not mine or yours, right? So I want to get politicians to switch from the easy path of going to an industrialist and going out and raising resources from the public. It's good for the politician too, because the politician then will have reached out and built a larger support base, right? Okay, so we want to move from one kind of politics to another. That's also not easy. In the US, if you think about what politicians do, they spend a lot of their time fundraising because they're also, the same issue applies. Hardly a perfect solution, but it's better than selling our polity to just a bunch of rich industrialists, is what I'm arguing, right? That incentivizing you don't need for bureaucrats. Bureaucrats have signed up for a particular job with a particular set of salaries, etc., and are expected to work under those circumstances. Politicians need resources to stay competitive in elections. That's the difference. Okay. Go ahead.
Hello. So, in addition to public funding and realistic caps for politicians, do you think elections will also help in curbing corruption and minimizing expenditure by political parties?
So, simultaneous elections, this is our Prime Minister's sort of frequent mantra these days. See, that there's a constitutional aspect to that, which you guys will figure out, which is that, assemblies are elected for 5 years, and if you want to truncate their term just for some purpose or the other, that doesn't sound very appropriate in terms of representation and the original constitutional intent, right? But it is true, on the other hand, that elections all the time do have some kind of a extra expenditure impact, right? Elections themselves, from the government's point of view, cost a lot of money. Overt expenditure is the actual cost of running the election. The uncounted expenditure is all these officials and even school teachers who are diverted from their work for a month and whose salaries are not counted, or for that matter, a code of conduct, and therefore a lot of work doesn't get done. All these things are all part of the larger cost of elections. There's another cost of elections, which is in the nature of the way the election process works out. If I want to run for the Lok Sabha in next year, I will go and talk to my MLAs and MLA candidates and say, hey guys, I need you to help me out, right? And they will go to the next level in Bangalore City, corporators, and say, hey guys, we need to mobilize. We need to have organized little rallies across the constituency. I don't necessarily pay for that, I may, but those guys will also pay for that. So the corporators pay for their own election, they pay partly for the MLA's election, and certainly partly for the MP's election. So each of these elections is an additional burden on anyone in the political system, right? So if you were to have maybe one election or one election every 2.5 years or something like that, those are compromises. The argument that this diverts our attention from governance, that Mr. Modi himself must answer. Nobody is asking him to go and campaign anywhere. If he hadn't come to Karnataka, I would have been very happy in the last election. But the basic thing is, he loves to be out there doing, either on a foreign trip or campaigning in an election somewhere. So that's just the reality. But basically, simultaneous elections will reduce the costs, certainly. But how do you deal with this constitutional aspect? That's the challenge. Again, maybe we don't look for perfection. We may say that in every year, across the country, there'll only be one election day. The US does that. November 8th or the first Tuesday of November is the day when typically elections across the country for all positions are held, right? That has its own negatives because you may be focused on the senator election and not on the person, your local representative or something like that. All those are challenges, but you could have more systematic ways of doing that. November 8th, election day or something, every year. And that's when all elections are adjusted. Right? So even if a state loses a majority government, you wait for 9 months, 10 months, for the next election. But that's something that we have to evolve as a national consensus. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, what about the ladies in the classroom? I won't leave without some gender balance in the questions here. Okay, go ahead. Who had questions up? Yes, go ahead.
So you talked about incentivizing public funding. So would you say that the low level of public funding and public participation in, public involvement with parties is largely because of the major parties being internally undemocratic? For example, in the US, they have the primaries. So there is much more participation there. So do you think there can be any similar practices that can be incorporated into our political process?
Yeah, so I agree with your viewpoint there, which is that, which is the cause, which is the effect, right? I'm saying that the cause is really the fact that resources come to the center, to the high command, and therefore everyone else, parties actually atrophy. Because it doesn't matter what you do on the ground, who is your godfather is what matters, right? So, you don't even put in that kind of effort on the ground. That's one of the challenges. So in the primaries, in fact, in the Congress party, we experimented with primaries in the last Lok Sabha election. Okay, I actually lost a primary election in March 2014 in Bangalore North. But in June, I was elected to the Rajya Sabha. But the basic point is, if you are funding candidates, there's nothing that comes in the way of a candidate going out there under this system and demonstrating the kind of fundraising capability, support he has. In which case, parties will come to him and say, or her, okay, and say, come on, please be our candidate, right? That's the logic. That's how we will be able to promote intra-party democracy. That's why I'm saying it should go to candidates, not just to the party. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Rudra, I'm from third year in this college. So the question, which if I understand correctly, is which is to increase or remove the spending cap.
Right.
So, sir, I would like to take you a few years back when the UPA government was in power in the center, and it was in power in my home state as well. At that time, I heard the then Chief Minister of Maharashtra, Prithviraj Chavan, saying that RTI shouldn't apply to politics. And even today, the BJP government has introduced electoral bonds. So, sir, when you make this argument that the cap should increase, at the same time, political parties all running away from the responsibility attached to illegal funding. So at that time, today
we're still opposing RTI under the current circumstances, right? Why? Because we don't think of ourselves as a, what's the term, public agency or something. We're an association of persons. We're not, we're not a public body in the traditional sense that should be audited by somebody else. However, I ran through the last slides. I do say that if you take public funding, then certainly open up your accounts for audit. But it's never clearly understood by political parties why you want to have RTI. You want to know why we chose this candidate or the other? Why we passed this resolution or the other? What are you trying to get from the RTI? If you want to know numbers, we do submit audited accounts to the income tax authorities. All right? So basically, these are all resolvable, but only if we get public funding or something, which will provide an obligation, put an obligation on us to actually be, to be responsive on that front. Okay. I mentioned gender balance, and there we have the first instance. Yeah.
We'll take one last question because I think
you also had a question, Siddharth, or afterwards? Oh, okay.
So, sir, if campaigns are like fully paid for through public funding, then isn't there little incentive? Isn't there only little incentive for gathering community support through soliciting donations or enrolling community members? Thus, in a way, it might reinforce status quo.
Actually, so one part of the public funding was matching grants based on community contributions. Actually, India has a long tradition of that. Mahatma Gandhi was a phenomenal fundraiser from the community. Okay, and Aam Aadmi Party recently demonstrated that they were able to do that as well. And people will say, "Ek vote, ek note." Don't just vote for me; give me a note as well. That sort of thing. So, so it's not ruled out. Public funding, for past performance that will not have this incentive. But this other part, the matching grant for what you've collected in small donations from larger groups of people, that incentivizes parties to go out and build a base and to get people to own the candidate in a more direct sense, right? So I think that not fully but partly addresses the concern you have. Okay. Any other questions? Anyone else? Okay. Oh, one last question there. Sorry.
Okay, this is about public funding as a medium of election funding. So what happened in the US that a lot of liberals win elections through public funding and they defeat people who take money through corporations. But what I've noticed is that in India is not a matured people don't take elections seriously enough. This is a trend given their vote, so that they don't vote according, they don't contribute too much to public funding. For example, the AAP party, this was in an urban area. It was Delhi, it was an urban area. But most of our country is not literate enough, is not ready to accept elections, contribute their own money in elections and take the elections seriously enough because they don't realize the consequences. Right? So don't you think that we are currently in a position where we only big money through corporations because we reach most of the population?
So I actually think there's again this cause and effect problem in this analysis. Since a lot of the players are already very wealthy, people don't see any reason to contribute to them, right?